welcome everyone. It is 10:30 and we want to get started promptly so we have enough time for our speakers and for people to go to their other obligations after this program. My name is Mary Warner. I'm the Executive Director of the Morrison County Historical Society. This is program number 1 of our Exploring History and Culture in Central Minnesota February event series. This series is hosted annually by 4 Central Minnesota County Historical Societies, the Morrison County Historical Society, Benton, Sherburne, and Stearns County Historical Societies. Our series seeks to foster greater understanding and awareness of cultures that have been and continue to be part of Minnesota and its history. This year's programming is presented by the Hill Museum and Manuscript Library, otherwise known as HMML, it is based in St. John's University in Collegeville, Minnesota. It will feature 4 presentations on consecutive Saturdays in February. So today, February 5th, the 12th, the 19th, and the 26th. And each one has its own curator and topic. So in addition to the online Saturday programs from HMML curators, each partner site will have an exhibit of manuscripts from HMML for 2 weeks. From February 5th through the 17th, exhibits will be at the Stearns History Museum in St. Cloud and the Morrison County Historical Society's home, which is the Charles A. Weyerhaeuser Memorial Museum in Little Falls. And these exhibits are already up, thanks to Tim Turnus at HMML, and they are beautiful. Come on in and see them. Exploring History and Culture in Central Minnesota, the Hill Museum and Manuscript Library event series is made possible by the voters of Minnesota through a grant from the Central Minnesota Arts Board, thanks to a legislative appropriation from the Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund, otherwise known as a legacy grant. So please be sure to thank the Central Minnesota Arts Board and our legislators for making this happen, and pat yourselves on the back for being voters who voted for it. We want to introduce, first I'm going to talk about the tech and Zoom tools here. If you need tools, they are at the bottom of your screen. If you just move your mouse, you will see them. There's a mute, the stop video, participants, chat. We will have a question and answer at the end, please, and just stick your questions in the chat. We will be monitoring them and watching for them. We also have a live transcript feature. So if you want to be able to read what people are saying at the bottom, just select to have that on, and you should also have reactions. So now I want to introduce today's co-host for the event, which is Caitlin Carlson of the Stearns History Museum. Caitlin, take it away.
Okay, thanks, Mary. So I'm here to introduce today's program. Today we are lucky enough to have Dr. Daniel K. Gullo with us. He is the Joseph S. Micallef Director of the Malta Study Center. So today's discussion is called The Order of St. John of Jerusalem, Culture and Community. And it's going to feature a look at the Sovereign Military Hospitaller Order of St. John of Jerusalem, or Rhodes, and of Malta as a religious order and sovereigns of the island of Malta through its organization, culture, and religious life. Founded in the 12th century, this unique religious order grew from a small gathering of laity and knights to a sovereign power in the Mediterranean island of Malta, whose members continue their mission to care for the poor and sick today. So Dr. Gullo is going to talk, and then there's going to be a Q&A session at the end, like Mary said. So go ahead and put those questions in the chat. And with that said, I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Gullo.
Thank you, Caitlin, and thanks to all of the organizers from the historical societies here in central Minnesota. It's a great pleasure to be here today and to share a bit of history, particularly because we are enjoying a nice frosty morning, and it's a nice way to take advantage of the winter months to learn a bit more about our shared human past. My talk today is going to be split into 3 different parts. The first part will be a very, very brief introduction to HMML and the Malta Study Center, since my colleague, Dr. Matt Heinzelman, will be going into this history in depth during his lecture. It's both a plug for his his wonderful discussion, as much as it is a way of saving a little bit of time to the broader topic. The second thing I'm going to do, because many are probably unfamiliar with the history of the Order of St. John, I will provide a very brief history of the order from its foundation through the year 1798. It's a bit of a daunting task because it's an order of great complexity and over 900 years of history on an international scale. So you'll bear with me that if it seems a bit superficial, it is done through necessity, not from desire. And finally, I will speak and focus largely on the Knights as part of the Order of St. John, which was made up of a variety of different members and community, looking at some aspects of their lives and activities, as it would have been largely during the 18th century, before the order left the island of Malta. Before I begin, I'm going to, in the common chat for everybody, add a few links. These links will link you directly to the Hill Museum and Manuscript Library, to the Malta Study Center, to the Malta Study Center collections, and to our online database, vhimmel.org, and also to the Malta Study Center's Facebook page in case you use it in order to follow the activities of the center. And with that, I will go ahead and share my screen. And can you activate my sharing? I've been disabled to share at the moment.
You should be good to go now.
Okay, thank you. There we go. Want to make sure everybody can see this? Okay. So to begin with, as mentioned, the Malta Study Center is located at the Hill Museum and Manuscript Library at St. John's University in Collegeville, Minnesota. The Hill Museum and Manuscript Library began in 1965 as an effort to preserve manuscript collections in Europe, primarily in Austria and in Germany, and then expanded this to a worldwide effort to save endangered manuscript cultures in the Middle East, Africa, Europe, and Asia. Today, our library, which is, you can see here from its we'll call it refoundation in 2014, our beautiful reading rooms. So please come and take a look at our place and our own exhibits when we put them online. The Malta Study Center itself was founded almost a decade after the Hill Museum began. It was actually founded in 1973 by Joseph S. McAuliffe, the Honorary Consul General of St. Paul, Minneapolis, who had become a Consul General after Malta separated itself from the British Empire as a colony and became a sovereign republic in 1965. And here we can thank, Joseph McAuliffe, who's with us and still the chair of the board of the Friends of the Malta Study Center today, is leading the Maltese community here in Malta. He's also a member of the Order of St. John of Jerusalem as a Knight of Obedience. And so he combines the two missions of the Malta Study Center together. One, which is to preserve and share the handwritten heritage of Malta, while at the same time preserving and sharing the handwritten heritage of the Order of St. John of Jerusalem, which is also known as the Order of Malta because of its time on the island from 1530 to 1798. The Malta Study Center is unique as it's the only study center here at Himmel. We used to have a few more, but now we have this one. It has its own unique endowment, allowing it to maintain and perpetuate its activities of preservation and access. We have over 70 partners in Malta and the United States and Europe. And we maintain here a collection of over 16,000 reels of microfilm and 2.5 million digital images, encompassing, to my guess, somewhere between 30 and 40,000 manuscripts.
I need this chair.
We have roughly 400 local manuscripts and rare books in our collection downstairs, some of which will hopefully be put on display at the end of February as part of a new exhibition on the Great Siege of Rhodes of 1522. And for those who want to see our collections, I'm very proud to have this beautiful and accessible online resource for you, which is linked in the chat. Himmel Reading Room and Himmel Museum are free. You can see all of the items in there with registration, which is also free. And then in Reading Room, you can look at the archival, manuscript, and printed materials. And in Museum, it's the place where you go to look at the art collections. So both of them are there for you to enjoy. And with that, we will move quickly on to our primary subject today, which is to take a look at the remarkable history of the Order of St. John of Jerusalem, a history which began in the 11th century. The 11th century in Europe was a remarkable period of time. It had just emerged from what scholars known as like a century of crisis during the 10th century, which was subject to certain invasions, both from the north with the Vikings, from the east, from the Magyars, and from the south, from the expansion of Muslims through North Africa and into Spain, Sicily, and Italy. And it had emerged and started expanding out. And expansion was both territorial and financial. They were increasing in their economy. And through this confidence, a movement known as the Pauperis Christi, which was a generic general movement among Europeans for the poor of Christ, began to associate themselves with a kind of a renewed attention to trying to live according to the lives of the apostles. And part of that meant going on pilgrimage to Jerusalem in order to see the sites and to do so as an act of penance, and also just simply to explore a part of their heritage. At the time, of course, Jerusalem was underneath the control of Muslim rulers. And so pilgrimage there took place and needed local support. And in the 11th century, Italians from Amalfi began a hospital to take care of these pilgrims. Now, this is not a hospital in the modern sense of the term. It was more of a hostel hospice. So it was taking care of the sick, but it was also providing in many instances respite for those who were dying. This hospital was known as the Hospital of St. John the Baptist, and it was founded in the 1070s. And it's from this name that the Order of St. John also gains its other name, known as the Hospitalers, meaning those who take care of and run a hospital. It was originally associated with a Benedictine monastery, which makes perfect sense for us here at St. John's because we are located at a Benedictine abbey, and this tradition continues to the day. At the time, the Benedictines provided them with some spiritual support and guidance, because the members who ran the hospital were lay brothers. They were not monks at this time, which is very important, nor were they part of a religious order. They were lay brothers who took simple vows, probably poverty and chastity, and they probably wore distinctive clothing, but they were not part of any official organized religious order. They probably followed a version of the rule of Saint Benedict, but that did not mean that they were Benedictines. They were simply using it as a way to guide their life. Things changed 30 years later as a result of the First Crusade, a large military movement which originated in the West to reconquer Jerusalem and also to provide support to the Byzantine Greek Empire as it was facing military threats from a revived Muslim and Turkish population during the 11th century. This crusade conquered Jerusalem in 1099. And at this point, things changed dramatically for this community governing the hospital. First, they were now underneath the ecclesiastical control of a Latin patriarch with obedience to Rome. And this Latin patriarch was resident in the Holy Sepulchre and associated with him Augustinian canons to support the mission of the patriarch. Secondly, they were now underneath a Western ruler who came from Europe and was installed to govern these new crusader states. And in this case, it would have been the Kingdom of Jerusalem associated with the other crusader states to the north. They remained lay brothers at the time, keeping their simple vows and distinctive clothing, but they had now adopted a form of the rule of St. Augustine, which makes sense because they were now associated with the Latin Patriarch rather than the Benedictine community. They began receiving gifts to support their mission. These were properties, but they also started receiving exemptions, meaning that they no longer had to pay taxes. These gifts occurred in the Middle East, but they also occurred in Europe, primarily in France, Italy, and the eastern and northern parts of what is now Spain. At the time would have been the kingdoms of Aragon and Castile. Because of this new political status, the community began what many religious communities were doing at this time, which is to seek a sense of identity to develop itself from this local community of lay brothers into a more organized institution. This was part of a process, and although the order today looks at the papal privilege of 1113 as a kind of foundation moment, what we see here is something more generic with the emergence of religious orders in the 12th century, which is a kind of a process which occurs over time rather than a distinct moment, looking back even to the 1070s as a moment when the hospital had already existed. So in 1113, a member of the community was appointed and sought papal protection from Pope Paschal II to give independence to the community. And this, of course, is an extremely important part of the foundation of a religious order, to remove it from the direct control of the bishop, in this case, the patriarch, and kind of make it, in a sense, a unique community with allegiance directly and underneath the Pope itself. This identity as a religious order emerged more fully during the 1120s and 1150s. First of all, getting an organized rule. For an order to be an order, it has to have a rule and a constitution to follow, statutes. And it was a rule based upon the Augustinian rule, which would govern them. They were also given the rights to elect their own master over the brothers, rather than having one appointed. And they were given exemptions from excommunication and interdict, meaning that, again, another way of separating themselves as a religious organization, all of which occurred during the 1120s and 1150s. Through various papal actions. The third major change, of course, was militarization. At its foundation, the order was, of course, a hospitaller order. It was a group of laymen who were engaged in the helping and spiritual and physical care of pilgrims that came to the Holy Land. And in this case, however, we see a militarization of the order as a response to a repeated military crisis affected by the Crusader kingdoms. It was a logical extension of protecting the health of the pilgrims to protecting them physically as they arrived on the coast and journeyed into Jerusalem, always a subject to robbers and highwaymen, as well as military incursions from competing Muslims, territories and kingdoms on the outside. There was always a manpower shortage in these kingdoms also. Many of the crusaders who came to the Holy Land stayed for a time and then returned home, having fulfilled their vow of pilgrimage and crusade activity. And in this militarization of some of these brothers was an eventual consequence. We can see this with the founding of the Templars in 1120 as an example of this taking place. Part of the militarization came from the donation of castles by the King of Jerusalem to the Hospitallers, even before they became militarized. Thus, it was a logical extension of their administrative policies to turn from simply hiring mercenaries to protect their castles and lands to becoming protectors themselves. Thus, we see during the 1130s and 1140s, knights becoming members of the order. These would have been nobles who had to have some privilege of nobility and the ability to afford in this case, both horses and arms, but also servants of arms, freemen who would have been able to fight as well as serve the community. So the 11th and I should say the 12th century saw a major expansion of what it meant to be a member of the Order of St. John of Jerusalem. We see the original lay brothers, but we also see the knights becoming members, nobles who were there for the primary purpose of fighting and defending, but also still continued to serve, and this is incredibly important, still continued to serve as members of a religious order with vows to also take care of the poor and the sick. They were monks and they were knights at the same time with both religious obligations and military obligations. Similar status was afforded to the servants of arms, both with the issue of fighting, but also support. We see in the 12th century the emergence of sisters of the Order of St. John, sisters who did not live in the Holy Land in the East, but were members of the order in Europe with their own buildings, often in relationship with members of the Order of St. John that existed in Europe. Lay members or donats, these were people who joined the order but did not take full vows until later in life, but were members of the order nonetheless. Chaplains, priests who served the order to perform the liturgical duties became members of the order, but also to provide ministry and sacraments to the sick and the dying. And a unique, interesting group known as confraters. These are men and women who did not officially join the order, but paid dues to the order to gain the spiritual benefits of the order. Much like the Knights of Columbus today form a kind of confraternity membership. They support the order and gain privileges, but are not actually members of the order. It's a kind of half in, half out type of status. The order, of course, expanded tremendously in the 12th century, and while the order began in Jerusalem, it quickly became an international order, which still defines the order today as an international hospitaller order. And in this case, we can see the setting up of commanderies. These are estates which support the brothers and help upkeep the members located across Europe. But as part of their responsibility was to collect money from these estates and send it to the East in order to support both the hospital and military activities of the order. Religious houses of men and women, particularly the sisters, were established, especially in Spain, France, and England, and Italy. Each of these, of course, became underneath an administrative unit known as a priory. The green circles here are the 7 traditional priories located in Europe. We will get to these a little bit later. But the central convent remained in Jerusalem, which also held the central infirmary, which remained its kind of focus as a hospitaller mission to take care of pilgrims in the Holy Land. As a matter of perspective, it's important to point out that the Order of St. John of Jerusalem emerged at a time when other military religious orders were emerging. The Templars were founded in 1120. Though they didn't strictly have a hospitaller aspect, they did have the military religious order side to them. They were monks that fought. The Order of St. Lazarus of Jerusalem was founded in the 12th century, taking care largely of lepers. It was also a military order by the 1150s. The Teutonic Order, another international military order, was founded at the end of the 12th century and also had hospitaller aspects to it, running a hospital in Jerusalem and later in Accra and other areas. National military orders also emerged in Spain. Spain at this time was, of course, divided between both Muslim and Christian rule. And these military orders, though not having hospitaller qualities, were largely organized in order to protect Christians and also to advance Christian territory against Muslims in Spain and North Africa. In brief, the order, of course, suffered along with the other Crusader states with the emergence of stronger Muslim powers in the East at the end of the 12th century. And by 1188, they needed to move their headquarters from Jerusalem to Accra. where they resided until 1291. When the city of Acre fell, they then moved the order to Cyprus. And most significantly, in 1310, they established a, for lack of a better, sovereign island state on the island of Rhodes and other islands in Greece. This movement to this territory in 1310 was very significant to the identity of the Order of St. John. First of all, the territory was conquered from the Greek Christian Byzantine Empire. So it saw its expansion to this area as part of the general antagonism between the Greek East and the Latin West, even though they maintained their primary mission of being a military order organized to fight and defend Christianity and the Catholic West. Secondly, this territory was their own. So for the very first time in the history of the Order of St. John, they owned territory, which required a formal restructuring of the community into a political administrative body, rather than simply being a community underneath and working underneath other Christian kings. This meant that they're in Rhodes, they needed to really truly understand and redefine their community. The national priories became national longs, which is translated as tongue, based upon the language, the primary languages that people spoke. These were divided into 3 areas of France, not simply because linguistically France had such a diversity of language at the time, but largely because there were so many different commanderies that they needed a splitting of the organization. It was also divided in England, Castile, Aragon, which is an area that speaks Catalan, not Castilian, Italy as a whole, and Germany. These national longs also had fixed administrative roles in the order, just like any government. So in France, for example, the head of the Long of France was made the head of, called a hospitaller, the head hospitaller, therefore in charge of all of the infirmary and hospitaller activities of the order as an administration. The head of Italy was the admiral, therefore in charge of all of the naval forces of this new order island state. The head of Germany be in charge of the treasury. So what became this kind of religious order organized according to religious communities now becomes closely tied as an administrative and sovereign order in many ways. So we can see here the emergence of a community that is both political and administrative, while also religious and military at the same time. The order was very successful in its control of Rhodes. And this success, of course, led to its downfall. The fact of the matter is that the Order of St. John was incredibly good in its mission, both as a military organization and a hospitaller organization. And as a result, it incurred the wrath of the Ottoman Turks, who saw them as an impediment to their ability to invade Europe and to gain rather more control over European properties. When the Ottomans conquered Constantinople in 1453, they quickly realized they needed to defeat the Order of St. John in Rhodes in order to expand to the west in the Western Mediterranean. And for this, in the year 1480, they engaged in a siege, which they did not win. This was a significant thorn in the side into the mental and political ambitions of the Ottomans. And so they returned to Rhodes in 1522. And after a siege of several months, were finally able to conquer the island. The defense of Rhodes was such that the Ottomans at this time allowed the knights to leave with not only their archives and relics, but also with substantial parts of the population out of sheer respect to the determined resistance of the knights and their defense of the island. At this point, the order had to move west. And in 1530, after 8 years of wondering where they might settle up, they convinced the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V to give them the island of Malta, which at this time was given to them as a fief, which they held underneath the King of Sicily and Naples. Charles at this time was the Holy Roman Emperor, which meant that he controlled not only the imperial provinces of Germany and Austria, but also the kingdoms of Spain, Portugal, and the associated kingdoms of Sicily and Naples. So he gave Malta at this time to the order as the leader and king of Sicily and Naples. The order was charged with the defense of Christendom from the island of Malta, but because of its geographic location, it became truly a maritime power. When this was done, they were also given as lords the ability to recreate their order island state. And in this, they took all of the things that they learned in Rhodes and transferred them to Malta, reshaping Malta, which up to this point had little bit more than a province of Sicily, to an independent state underneath the order of St. John. The Ottomans, however, were aware of the Knights and their new geographic location, and the Knights quickly took advantage of this, and they used it into their advantages. The Ottomans led a great army in 1565, and from June until September 1565, laid siege to the island of Malta. This time, however, the Knights, given both their military prowess and eventual support from both Spain and Sicily, were able to drive out the Ottomans. This led the Knights to develop a new identity, which had suffered after Rhodes, and validated their role in Europe as defenders of Christendom. Both Protestant and Catholics saw them as an essential part of the defense of Europe. And they did receive support from both Protestant Europe and Catholic Europe during this time. Most significantly, because of the Great Siege, it led the order to the foundation of the city of Valletta in 1566. This is a complete Renaissance city, built with the ideas of the Renaissance. And the order saw this city both as a capital, but also as a convent. It was a city built by gentlemen for gentlemen, while at the same time built to house a religious order. Here you saw the national longs have their own estates called alberges, which is where they would have their own local control within the convent, while at the same time they brought the sisters to the island for the very first time. So the order, as an old order, saw Malta as a place that could realize its complete identity as a religious order, while putting into practice all of the political, military, and administrative goals that were associated with governing an order island state. It saw its expansion as a naval power up until the 18th century, maintaining a very active and powerful galley squadron, and like other military powers, expanding to a frigate fleet in the 18th century. They maintained what we would now call privateers, that is, corsairs that fought alongside the Order of St. John. And like other powers during the maintain, they were largely able to fund this, not only through the money acquired from their estates in Europe, but also through their active participation in the slave trade. The Mediterranean at this time engaged in what was known as a slave economy, where the capture of slaves were redeemed through financial purposes, as well as using those slaves to man the ships and the galleys. So it became an extremely wealthy part. And like other European and North African and Middle Eastern areas, they were fully part of this slave economy at this time. During the 18th century, because of the growing power of the order and its own sense of identity, it finally broke from its status as a fief and saw itself as sovereign. And during the 1740s and 1750s, under Grand Master Emmanuel Pinto, it took on the idea of being the sovereign military order of St. John of Jerusalem, of Rhodes, and Malta. It established ambassadors and consuls throughout Europe and in the Middle East. It took on a strict policy of neutrality with regarding European partners, But most importantly, the Grand Master became not only the head of a religious order, but also a sovereign prince. And this is most clearly exemplified in this painting by Antoine Fevre, executed for Grand Master Pinto, where he points at the crown of a prince resting on the table while wearing his habit as the head of a religious order. The order itself maintained this position until 1798, when the island was conquered by Napoleon Bonaparte as part of his expansion into the Mediterranean on his way to conquer Egypt. The order, of course, survived the fall of Malta in 1798, but because it's an extremely complex history and because we want to talk a little bit more about the culture and the community, I will leave that for another lecture at another time. So with the time I have left today, I'm going to talk about the knights themselves. They are the most famous part of the order. And although I could talk about the broader community, I thought it would be better to focus on one group, and that these, of course, being the knights themselves. Here I'm really going to be speaking about the knights as they existed in the 17th and 18th century, rather than taking a look as they are today. So the first thing to need to understand about the knights and joining the order is that they could join as minors or as adults. There were very strict rules on joining the order. First of all, you needed to be a noble. You could not become a knight without being a noble. The only exception that could potentially be made to this was a special class of knights known as Knights of Grace, who were not truly full members of the order because they couldn't rise to all of the ranks and administrative positions. Knights of Grace were largely given as honorary associations to very famous artists, like Caravaggio is probably the most famous example of this. But in general, all knights needed to be members of nobility, and you had to prove that new nobility through a very extensive process. What you see here on the right is a part of a proof of nobility where the knight Cedronio Francesco Cedronio is trying to show that his family, from both the Giussofo and Platomoni sides of his family, had descended from nobility going all the way back into the 16th century. You also needed to prove your Catholic faith, meaning you had legitimacy of birth and that your parents were married within the Catholic Church and that you had been baptized. These proofs of nobility could be very extensive documents totaling in the hundreds of pages and would go through review not only by the local long, but also by the central convent. There were general requirements of joining, but interestingly enough, each of the national longs could have their own requirements. So joining as a member of the order was very difficult in Germany, while it was a little less difficult in Italy. Rejection was also possible. After review, people could find your proof not being adequate enough. You could appeal this, but it was very difficult to appeal on a rejection. Once you joined the order, you went through a period of novitiate. The time of this could change. Sometimes these novitiates were waived. So for after the Great Siege of Malta, when so many knights died defending the order, you could reduce the amount of time. But in general, it would have been 1 year. This would have followed a measure of profession, similar to other religious orders. Once you had been approved and gone through a novitiate period of training, you would profess in front of the community, taking the vows of poverty, obedience, and chastity, and these were vows for life. And you agreed at that moment to live according to the religious rules of the community, submitting oneself to the statutes governing that community of time. Remembering here, you not just simply joined the order as a whole, but you also joined one of the national longs. And what's interesting about this is that rank in the order was not about how old you were, but it meant when you joined. So for example, if you take a look at the document here, which is a ruolo or a list of members, you can see at the top the area from which they came. Here was like Bartolomeo Mariscotti came from Rome. He was born in 1747 and he joined in 1759. If you follow down the column, you can see a member who was born in 1738 but joined in 1761. Even though his age was higher, his rank within the order was lower because he joined at a later date. So it wasn't how old you were, it was how long you served in the order. So in general, the earlier you joined, the greater potential you had in rising within the community. It was expected that you would live in the central convent for a period of time after joining the order, and you would have lived in the auberge, these kind of palazzos, very beautiful palazzos for the members, or if you had enough money, you would live outside and go to the auberge to engage in your community life. And you receive distinctions on service. The most important of these service would have been engaging in caravanes, which would have been military activities during the fleet of the order. This is a noble order, so rank and distinction matters. The document here on the right is the listing of the procession that takes place for the great crosses of the order, meaning that if you are going to proceed, this was the membership, how they proceed in line. So in this case, the great commander goes before the marshal, the prior goes before the great conservator, and even the priors are listed in order. So Saint-Gilles has precedence over Auvergne, and Auvergne has precedence over France. So all of these have precedence in a society that understood nobility and the ranking of nobility being essential to that community. And if you stepped out of order, that was a grave fault, and you could be punished for that infraction. Their lives were religious lives. Regardless of their administrative and military responsibilities, these were members of the order and a religious order. They would engage in prayer on a daily basis, confession, and mass. They would be responsible for the care of their brothers, not only in their local community, but also the community of the whole. And they were required to gather annually in chapter to administer the order as part of a religious community. We can see this here as a French translation of the Office of the Virgin Mary, which would have been sent as part of their daily prayer activities. Hospital care was extremely important, but it was also care for the poor. The Sacra Infermeria, or the Holy Infirmary of Malta, could take care of hundreds of patients at a time. And these care was not exclusionary. So both criminals and slaves could also be cared for in this same infirmary. It was extended to all, regardless of status. They were still a military order through the 18th century. And as this, they were required to go out and serve in the fleet. If you did not serve in the fleet, you would be prohibited from becoming a commander and therefore owning your own or administering your own commandery in one of the priories in Europe. You could also be required at times to defend landed territories. And so during what are called alarms, that is when they felt under threat of an invasion, the order would send out a general call for the knights in Europe to return to Malta in order to defend the island against an incoming invasion. And as this, they were also members could be expert engineers in defending the island against invasion. Because they were a political body, they would be required at times to serve as administrations of governments. That meant locally as judges in courts and administering local civil and criminal proceedings, but also serving as ambassadors and consuls to other states. Because the order controlled lands throughout Europe, they had to administer these lands, but also responsible improving those lands. The document that you see here on the right is an instruction manual how to best administer properties and to provide those properties to benefit the order as landed estates. The knights came from wealthy families, and as such were and could be incredible artists. Here is an example from Fra Mattia Preti, who joined the order as a Knight of Grace, and then later as a Knight of Justice, as a full member of the order. Mattia Preti, of course, is a world famous Baroque artist, and here is a preparatory drawing that was used for his painting of the co-cathedral of St. John in Valletta during the 17th century. The knights were also nobles and therefore became great patrons of architecture. Not only the Grand Co-Cathedral in Valletta, but the Grand Master's Palace in Valletta and the Verdala Palace in Malta are some of the prime examples of European Baroque architecture. In Europe itself, the commanderies and local chapels would be highly decorated examples of architecture and great patrons of art at the time. The order was known to have great engineers. Valletta itself is a monument to fortification, including the establishment of Fort Sant'Angelo, but also Forts Ricasoli and Fort Manuel were models of European architecture and engineering, so much so that they were frequently illustrated in manuals of engineering throughout Europe during the 17th and 18th century. This particular view from the 18th century gives an example of the amount of fortifications that were needed to defend the island as part of the identity of the order. Members of the order being, the knights being of these high classes were great poets and historians at times, engaging in literary and historical activities as other members of the nobility did throughout Europe. Here's a poem written about love by Stanislas Jean de Boufflers, which was translated, or not translated, which was issued in France and shared throughout his French community. This means that the knights joined these kind of literary societies and historical societies as other members of the nobility did. They shared in the same lives as the nobles, even though they remained members of a religious order. They were scientists. This is a treatise on color and the nature of color in prisms by Diego de Carvalho e Sampaio, published at the end of the 18th century. And as religious orders, they were also theologians. This is a treatise on the spirituality of being a Knight of Malta, done by Giacomo Bosio, produced in the middle of the 16th century. Because they were nobles and because they were members of religious orders, they sometimes strayed. We are talking about hundreds of orders. They do at times become lovers and famous lovers, or in this case, infamous lovers. Fra Jean-Jacques de Mem was the ambassador of the Order of France, who fell in love with a dancer named Mademoiselle Françoise Prévost, one of the primary inventors of modern ballet. He promised her, for being a lover, an annual 6,000 livres sum, which after he had his heart broken, he refused to give. She publicly admonished him for this, and he, in fact, lost a legal battle with her and was forced to pay the 6 livres over time. It was an infamous exploit. So in this case, we see the violation of religious vows, which did happen with members of a religious order at time. They could also be rebels, fighting against the order, not only piracy or smuggling, but in this case, rebels against their own order. Jean-Baptiste Bossuet de Rancilla, Napoleon conquered the order, conquered the island of Malta in 1798, left the order and became the president of the government of the island of Malta after that time. But it's important to remember, all in all, that this was a religious order. and as such that the members of the order engaged in a religious enterprise, which was done in order to seek salvation. The prayer life, the life to work with the infirm, and even their military activities were all done within the idea of being within a religious order. And as seen here through the Office of the Dead, this was about salvation. And so joining the religious order was a means by which one could organize one's life, one's religious life, in order to seek salvation at the end of time. And nothing says this more than the amount of time spent on the burial of the knights and the memory that the knights would have as they prayed in community in the co-cathedral in St. John today, and a drawing made for the tomb of Fra Alexandre de Loubert de Martinville, who died in 1749. And with that, I will end our talk about the Order of St. John. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Gullo. That was fascinating. And now I have a whole bunch of questions. However, I'm not going to ask all of them. I do want other folks to have a chance to ask questions. Please put them in the chat, but I will ask at least one of my questions. So this is an order of nobility, and folks have to do all of this, proving of their nobility and hand in tons of documents. So did anyone ever try to invent proofs to join?
The answer is invention is probably a better said as embellishment is a better way of putting it. There would have been attempts. First of all, let me say, it was more than just an order of nobility. And the sisters didn't stop, and sisters did not have to be nobles to join, nor did the chaplains or the servants of arms. So the order always included members who were not nobles. The distinction of being nobles was the ranking within the order. Only the nobles and the knights of justice were allowed to serve the highest rank within the order and to become the Grand Master. So just to say that, so in that sense. But yes, there were embellishments, which is why they had such a strict review process about joining. Because if you were made a member of the order, you were given not only the privileges of having you have to understand, if you became a member of the order, as it validated the nobility of your family. So it had benefits to the family, not just to the individual. And as a member of a religious order, as a nobleman, the family then incurred the prayers and benefits also. So here I'm kind of focusing on the spiritual dimensions of the unique knight, but that kind of transferred also to the family as a whole. So there were major advantages of doing this. And knights, had the benefit also because of their vows of poverty, obedience, and chastity to serve within their local communities in ways that other members of the family couldn't. So kings often employed knights within their own administration, particularly the King of France and the kings of Spain, because in so doing, they have to worry about the kind of favoritism that would come through inheritance, since the knights wouldn't be having children. So you could kind of put a knight in a position of power within the kingdom. This was particularly true within the military. So several knights from France served the French Navy, while at the same time retaining their status as members of the Order of St. John. In fact, in the United States during the American Revolution, Admiral de Grasse was a member of the Order of St. John of Jerusalem, and he was the head of the French Navy during the battles in the Chesapeake. So just an example.
Okay, thank you. It's so fascinating, just all of the complexities that go into this.
It's the difficulties of this presentation.
Yes, exactly. Do other folks have questions? Okay, so I have a question from Anne Marie. How often did they stray? Thinking of the dancer.
Um, in Valletta itself, I mean, you have to remember it wasn't, straying wasn't a good thing. Okay, they are members of a religious order. Prostitution was a significant problem in Valletta. It's a port. And as everybody understands, ports have a tendency to attract prostitution because of the amount of sailors coming to harbor. Knights did engage in this, and it was a problem. It wasn't condoned, and they could be punished severely for this. In fact, one of the difficulties that took place at the time was how to punish the knights who did stray. I wouldn't say it was overly frequent, and I don't want to minimize the religious aspect of the membership of the order. There were knights that were really quite devout, but in many respects, one has to imagine that noble families wanted their sons to join the order because they had no other option for them otherwise. If you had 7 sons, some of them had to be placed there, and they couldn't all inherit the property, which meant that some joined because of family obligation, not so much as a desire. So they did break the rules. I don't want to say how frequent it was because I don't know that answer. I will say it did happen. And at times the grandmasters had to crack down. And if they cracked down too severely, the knights would rebel against the grandmaster, which did happen. So there's a famous episode when the grandmaster wanted to restrict the carnival, which is this kind of great festivity right before the season of Lent that took place and does take place throughout the Mediterranean and other parts of Europe. The knights would use this as an episode of frolicking. And when the grandmaster wanted to crack down on this, the knights were not too happy about it. So there was always a tension between allowing a level of indiscretion, but at the same time making sure it was never public, really too public. My colleague Emmanuel Buttigieg would be a better person to speak about that. So I hope that answers enough.
Yeah. Okay, so I have a question from Ken. What is the status and condition of the order today? Are they still based on Malta?
The order's headquarters is now located in Rome. In short, what ended up happening in 1798 is that the order was thrown into disarray, not simply because they were forced to leave Malta, but as part of the revolutions in Europe, the vast majority of their landed estates were confiscated. The French confiscated them all in 1792 as part of the revolution. Spain, the king confiscated them all in 1802. Other parts of Europe, in England, for example, it took place with Henry VIII in the 16th century. From 1798 to 1801, the order actually moved to Russia. In a very strange move, the Tsar of Russia became Grand Master. It was an effort to provide some type of stability, but it was kind of counterintuitive because the Tsar was neither Catholic nor was he celibate or a member of a religious order. That failed. And then the order moved to Catania in Sicily for a period of time, then to Ferrara, and then to Rome in 1834. And the movement to Rome in 1834 reconstituted the order as it is today. It abandoned military and focused solely on hospitalier care, but it also retained all of the religious aspects of the order, but opened it up. So in 1834, you see it still retaining the traditions of the religious order. There are knights today who are knights of justice, who are fully professed members of a religious order, but there are also men and women called knights and dames who do not take full vows, but are also members of the order today. So it's a much larger organization today from the standpoint of membership, but it's also a distinguishing membership. So it's a both and. It's not as, you don't have to become a fully professed member like you did in the past, but you are still a member of the order.
Okay, I'm seeing I have 3 more questions, but we are also at 11:29. So what I want to do is do a quick wrap up for the entire event, and then If folks need to be able to leave, they can certainly do so. So I
I'm
really
willing to
want,
stay, just so you know.
you're willing to stay, great. So we'll answer the rest of the questions, but I do want to do our quick wrap up here, and then we'll stay on for extra questions. So I want to thank Dr. Gullo and for his presentation, and I want to thank HMML for bringing all of this programming to us. I also need to thank our sponsors, the Central Minnesota Arts Board, and of course the Legacy Program, and all of our partners within the February event series, the Benton, Sherburne, and Stearns County Historical Societies. I want to thank all of our attendees for coming today. We have 3 more events coming, February 12th, 19th, and 26th. You can register if you, again, at the same email you use, staff@morrisoncountyhistory.org. Remember that we do have exhibits on site and you really want to see those. So come on in if you can. And then we will be emailing a survey to follow up to help us evaluate our programming. So for those who need to leave, you may do so at this point. And thank you so much for coming.